At this point, we learned about data binding with interpolation and vbind, about event binding and views reactivity, especially also with features like computed properties or watchers. And these are all core features which you gotta know. I guess that's why they are in this basics section. There's one more basic building block into which I want to dive together with you, and that is styling, to be precise, dynamic styling. And I prepared a basic example for that, which you'll of course find attached to this lecture. With dynamic styling, I mean that in Vue, we can change the style of things on the page, well, dynamically, in reaction to something. For example, in reaction to a click or to the user entering something. Let me show you an example here. Let's first of all create a new app with Vue create app, pass in our object, store it in a constant maybe, and then call mount on our app to mount it to a place in our HTML code, in this case to this section which has the styling ID with hash styling. And now let's say we want to be able to click on those divs and highlight the div which is active. Now, one way of doing that, probably not the shortest way, but definitely a way that should be easy to understand, is that we have a data property here, or our data object here in this Vue app, as we did many times before. And in here, we keep track of which div, which demo div is selected. We could do this with box A selected, which we set to false initially, box B selected, and then box C selected. So I'm having three data properties with different names, which I will basically mentally connect to those divs. And initially they're all set to false because initially, let's say, no div is selected. Now let's add a click listener. We can not just add click listeners to buttons. We can listen to clicks on basically any HTML element. And I'll add a method in my methods object, therefore, which I want to fire when this div is clicked. I'll name it box selected. And actually, I want to get the box, so an identifier for which box was selected as an input. And then here I'll check if box is equal to, let's say, A. And if that's the case, I'll set this box A selected to true. Else if box is, let's say, B, I'll set this box B selected to true. And else if box is C, I'll set this box C selected to true. So these are the options we have here. And now on the click listener, I want to point at box selected, or to be precise, I'll use this alternative syntax of executing it myself by adding parentheses so that I can pass in A as a string as a value for this first div, and then repeat this on the other divs so that we have an easy way of using one and the same method for setting different boxes to selected. Currently, by the way, there is no way of unselecting them, but for the moment, that's all I need. So now we have ways of changing these data properties through clicks, but I mentioned that I want to dive into styling with you. Well, let's say we want to highlight when a box is selected. And we can do that with Vue. Let's say we want to change the border color of a box if it is selected. So of this first box, for example. Well, we can set styles either through CSS and CSS classes, or also with inline styles by using the style attribute, which is available on basically any HTML element. In there, you can do things like this: border color red. If I save that, we have a red color here on the first box, but of course this now always applies, not just sometimes. Well, we just need to bind style to a dynamic value, and we can do this with vbind or the shorthand just : style. But now here's a special thing. style, and also class, as you will see in a couple of minutes, are different. If you bind those dynamically with vbind, you can actually use a special syntax supported by Vue for these specific attributes, so for style and for class. You can now feed in an object here, which style normally does not want, but you can use it because that's a special Vue feature for style and class. And in there, you can have your CSS property name, border color, however, either wrapped between single quotes, because we have a JavaScript object here, and property names with dashes are not allowed there. So we either need quotes or, recommended and better, use the camel case version of that, where you omit the dash and the character after the dash simply is a capital character now. And then you could set this to red here, for example, or to make it really dynamic, check if box A is selected. So if this data property here is true, and use a ternary expression to check if that is truthy, so if it's true, and if that's the case, after the question mark, we set this to red. Otherwise, we set it to this gray color, so to this hex code. And that's a default ternary expression in JavaScript, which we can use here since we're binding this dynamically. This object syntax is a special feature supported by Vue for the style attribute specifically. And if I now save that and reload, we initially have this gray border color, but if I click on this box, it gets red. Now there's no way of turning it back to gray at the moment because we have no way of making it unselected, but that's not a problem here because I want to focus on the dynamic styling, and that is how you could set up styles dynamically with Vue, vbind, and this special style binding syntax.